911. I'm in my house. They're shooting. They're shooting. Who is shooting? How many times did you hear shooting? 10 times.
Those words came from 25-year-old Angela, hiding in her closet as a shooter brutally murdered her entire family. Usually, cases like this start with no obvious enemy, but this family had one. And there was just one huge problem. That supposed enemy had a rock-solid alibi. So who could have done this, and why?
How many bodies did we find?
3.
Yep. And who shot him?
Me.
Darien, Illinois, is the kind of place people move to when they want peace. With a population of just 22,000, it's a quiet suburb about 25 miles southwest of Chicago. Tree-lined streets, well-kept homes, strong schools, and neighbors who actually wave when they see you. The kind of place where violent crime feels like something that happens in other cities, not here. And the Kramer family fit perfectly into that picture. Jeffrey Kramer was 50 years old in 2010, a hard-working man who had built his life from the ground up. He owned Kramer's Towing, a local business that had been serving the community for years. Jeffrey was known as someone who worked long hours, took pride in what he did, and never turned away someone in need. His wife, Lori, was 51 and worked as an editor at McGraw-Hill, the education publishing company. She was organized, detail-oriented, and deeply devoted to her children. Now, Jeffrey and Lori had been married for 30 years by March of 2010. They had raised 3 children together: Anthony, who was 29 at the time, Angela, who was 25, and Michael, the youngest, who had just turned 20. The family was close-knit. They spent weekends together, attended Chicago sports games, Bears and White Sox for most of them, though Lori was famously a Cubs fan, and celebrated every holiday and milestone as a unit. Michael, the youngest, had recently enrolled at the Universal Technical Institute, following in his father's footsteps to learn a trade. He was excited about his future, full of energy, and well-liked by everyone who knew him. Anthony, the oldest, had been staying in the basement of the family home while he figured out his next steps. And Angela, the middle child, had recently gone through a difficult breakup and was living back at home with her parents while she rebuilt her life. By all accounts, the Kramers were a normal, loving family. They didn't have enemies. They didn't owe money to anyone. They kept to themselves, worked hard, and loved each other fiercely. But what they didn't know, what none of them could have known, was that someone close to them had been planning their deaths for months. On the night of March 1st, 2010, the Kramer household was quiet. Jeffrey and Lori had gone to bed upstairs. Michael was sleeping on the couch in the living room because his girlfriend was staying over and she had taken his bed. Anthony was downstairs in the basement. Angela was in her room, also upstairs, trying to get some rest. Everything seemed normal, safe, routine. But at some point in the early hours of March 2nd, someone approached the Kramer home. They didn't pick the lock. They didn't try to sneak in through an unlocked door. Instead, they grabbed a hammer and smashed the living room window. Loud, violent, deliberate. This wasn't a burglary. This was a message. Michael's girlfriend woke to the sound of shattering glass. She saw a figure dressed entirely in black climbing through the window. She screamed and ran, managing to escape through another exit before the intruder could reach her. But Michael wasn't as lucky. He jumped up from the couch and tried to confront the intruder, but the shooter didn't hesitate. Gunfire erupted. Michael was hit multiple times. He tried to crawl toward the kitchen, desperate to get away, but the shooter followed him and fired again, this time a single shot to the head. Michael Kramer, 20 years old, was dead. Upstairs, Jeffrey and Lori heard the gunshots and came running. They didn't know what was happening, only that their son was in danger. But as they reached the staircase, the shooter was already there. Jeffrey was shot near the front door, his body crumpling to the floor before he even had a chance to fight back. Lori made it a few steps down the stairs before she too was shot. Both were executed with close-range headshots as they lay on the ground. The entire attack lasted less than 5 minutes. Angela, still in her bedroom, heard everything. She heard the breaking glass. She heard her brother scream. She heard the gunshots over and over and over. And then she heard footsteps moving through the house, slow and deliberate, as if the shooter was making sure no one had been left alive. Terrified, Angela grabbed her phone and locked herself in a closet. She dialed 911 and whispered into the phone, praying the intruder wouldn't hear her.
911. I'm in my house. They're shooting. They're shooting.
Who's shooting?
Oh,
How many times did you hear shooting?
10.
10 times. Do you know where it's coming from? In the house?
Yes. I need help.
Okay, the officer got away. Just stay where you're at, okay?
In the basement, Anthony also heard the shots. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew it was bad. He climbed out of a basement window and ran toward the street, hoping to flag down help. That's where police found him when they arrived, standing outside, shaking, barely able to form words. Inside the house, investigators found a scene of absolute horror. 40 caliber shell casings littered the floor. Blood was everywhere. Jeffrey lay just inside the front door. Lori was on the stairs. Michael was near the garage. All three had been shot multiple times, with execution-style wounds to the head. Whoever did this wanted to make sure they didn't survive, but nothing appeared to be stolen. No drawers had been rifled through. No valuables were missing. This wasn't a robbery. This was personal.
Tell me what happened.
I was asleep on the couch and I heard a crash coming from like the outside, like the street coming in, so like the window, and then I heard a shot. And he was like, "Oh my God!" And then I think he got shot. Like I heard a gunshot, and then I ran.
When detectives began interviewing the survivors, the first person they spoke with was Angela. She was still in shock, barely able to process what had happened. But when they asked if she knew anyone who might want to hurt her family, she didn't hesitate. There was one person, her ex-boyfriend, Johnny Borizov.
I just split up with the father of my son right after Christmas.
Good guy?
He has his issues.
What kind of issues?
Anger management.
Is that why you left?
Yeah, on top of not ever being able to get along with my family and stuff that has gone on with my family and him. If you get on his bad side, then you will never be on his good side.
Now Angela and Johnny had been together for about 2 years. They had a child together, a baby boy. But according to Angela, Johnny had become increasingly controlling and abusive. He didn't want her seeing her family. He didn't want her going anywhere without him. And when she finally ended the relationship just after Christmas of 2009, he didn't take it well.
I don't want to say that because it's my son's father, but if you look at history in a whole year, there has been issues with my family and him.
Okay.
I realize that I cannot be with that guy.
Did you know where your bedroom's at?
Okay. He knows where everything is in the house.
Angela told police that Johnny had a history of violence with her family. About a year before the murders, he had pulled a knife on her father, Jeffrey, threatening to kill him. A month later, at a baby shower for their child, he got into a physical altercation with her mother, Lori. The Kramers had been so concerned about Johnny's behavior that they had supported Angela in filing for full custody of their son. And on the night of the murders, Johnny had the child with him. To investigators, this was a clear motive. Johnny Borizov was angry. In his mind, the Kramer family wasn't just an obstacle. They were the enemy. And if the pattern of escalating violence over the past year was any indication, Johnny was capable of acting on that rage. But there was one major problem with this theory. Johnny Borizov had an airtight alibi. On the night of March 1st, 2010, Johnny had been at a casino in the suburbs, one of those sprawling gaming complexes with hundreds of cameras covering every angle. Security footage showed him arriving in the early evening and staying until well past 4 a.m, long after the murders had taken place. He was seen at the slot machines, at the bar, moving through the casino floor at multiple points throughout the night. Time-stamped images placed him there during the exact window when the Kramer family was being executed in their home 20 miles away. There was no gap in the footage, and there's no way he could have slipped out, driven to Darien, committed 3 murders, and returned without being noticed. And when the news broke about the murders, Johnny did in fact call 911 and request a welfare check for Angela, and he sounded genuinely concerned.
911, what is your emergency? Johnny Borizov. I just saw the news, and I think my girlfriend's house got shot up.
Why are you concerned about it? Can I ask?
Is that a home invasion or whatever? I don't know.
You would like to see an officer?
Yeah.
And when he came in voluntarily to speak with investigators, he seemed more concerned with clearing his own name than with Angela's safety or the loss of 3 lives.
I didn't do anything wrong. I don't care if you guys think I did, but I didn't.
So they kept digging. Detectives obtained a warrant for Johnny's phone records and began meticulously combing through every call, every text, every contact in the days leading up to and following the murders. That's when they noticed something that didn't fit. There was a series of calls from a burner phone, an unregistered prepaid cell that couldn't be traced to any specific person. The calls had been made to Johnny multiple times in the hours and days after the murders, and whoever was on the other end had left a voicemail. Investigators pulled the recording. The voice was young, male, and panicked. He said he thought he was being followed. He said he didn't know what to do, and at one point he said his name, Jake. That single name opened a door investigators hadn't even known was there. They ran the name through their databases, cross-referencing it with known associates of Johnny Borizov and anyone connected to the Kramer family. And that's when a tip came in. Not from a witness to the crime, but from a concerned roommate. The man said his roommate, Jacob Nodarse, had been acting erratically since the murders. He was paranoid, barely sleeping, making strange comments about the case, and packing up his belongings as if he was about to run. The roommate didn't want to believe Jacob was involved, but something felt deeply wrong.
What did he say? I'm like, well, we just think I got, it's Jake. I'm kind of freaked out right now. I feel like something's wrong. I'm driving on the highway and I feel like there's nothing but cops around me. From the sound of his voice, it sounded like he was trying. And he's like, well, this might be the last time I ever, get to talk to you and stuff.
Did you ask why?
No. Darcy's always been depressed.
What do you think's going on?
I mean, I don't want to say he is whatever part of this, but if he had a hand in whatever happened, then he wouldn't handle it. He wouldn't be able to live with himself after it.
Investigators immediately shifted their focus. Who was Jacob Nodarse? And what was his connection to Johnny Borizov and the Kramer family? Jacob Nodarse was 23 years old in 2010, and by all accounts, his life had been falling apart for years. Raised in a strict Jehovah's Witness household, Jacob later told investigators that he had felt isolated and suffocated from a young age. His parents enforced rigid rules about who he could spend time with, what activities he could participate in, and how he was expected to behave. When he stepped out of line, the punishment was swift and physical. Jacob said he had been depressed since he was 10 years old, and by his teenage years, he had turned to drugs and alcohol as a way to cope with the loneliness and the pressure. By his early 20s, Jacob was adrift. He had no steady job, no clear direction, and no strong support system. And then, in the months leading up to the murders, a series of personal tragedies hit him all at once. 2 of his closest friends died, one in an accident, another from an overdose. Then, Jacob walked in on his girlfriend getting physical with another one of his friends, someone he had trusted completely. The betrayal shattered what little stability he had left. And most relevantly to this case, Jacob had recently lost his friendship with Michael Kramer. Jacob and Michael had been part of the same social circle. They weren't best friends, but they were close enough that Jacob considered Michael someone he could rely on. That changed when Michael found out that Jacob had been spending time with Johnny Borizov, Angela's abusive ex-boyfriend. To Michael, that was an unforgivable betrayal, And with that, Michael cut Jacob off completely. For Jacob, who was already emotionally fragile and isolated, losing Michael's friendship was another devastating blow. He felt abandoned, rejected, and worst of all, he felt like he had no one left. That's when Johnny Borizov stepped in. Jacob had met Johnny through drugs. Johnny sold them, Jacob bought them. It was a transactional relationship at first, nothing personal, just business. But Johnny was smart. He saw an opportunity in Jacob's vulnerability, and he began to cultivate it. He started talking to Jacob more, acting like a friend, telling him he understood what it was like to be misunderstood and cast aside. And then Johnny started telling stories about the organization he worked for, the powerful people he was connected to, the dangerous world he operated in. According to Johnny, he wasn't just some small-time dealer. He was part of a major drug gang, the kind of network that had reach, resources, and the willingness to use violence when necessary. Jacob believed every word.
Everywhere we went, he got respected like that by gang members, and I knew that they were clearly gang members. The crew would come after me if I didn't do this.
Is this Johnny tell you this?
Yeah, but he also told me I could just run. But he said, you know what's going to end up happening if you do that. I seriously thought they would catch up with my family.
In the weeks leading up to the murders, Johnny began planting seeds. He told Jacob that Angela was planning to expose the drug operation during the custody battle. She knew too much, Johnny said, and the gang leaders had decided she needed to be silenced. But it wasn't just Angela, it was the entire Kramer family. They were all liabilities. They all knew too much, and the order had come down from the top: eliminate the threat. Johnny painted it as inevitable, as something bigger than either of them. And then he added the final critical piece of manipulation. If Jacob didn't help, the gang would come after him and his family instead. Johnny made it clear that this wasn't optional. This was survival. Jacob was terrified. He believed the gang was real. He believed his family was in danger, and he believed that Johnny was the only person who could protect him or destroy him. So when Johnny laid out the plan, Jacob didn't say no.
How many bodies did we find?
3.
Yep. And who shot him?
Me.
Rick,
He's completely used me. I thought I had no other options. I really did.
And so when Johnny told him there would be multiple murders happening that night, carried out by different members of the gang, Jacob agreed to take on the Kramers. Johnny even gave him specific instructions. Break the window with a hammer, shoot everyone in the house, and make it look like a gang hit. Johnny said he would be killing someone more dangerous that same night, establishing his own alibi while Jacob did the dirty work. Of course, there was no gang. There were no other murders. Johnny Borizov was a small-time drug dealer with delusions of grandeur, and he had found the perfect person to manipulate. Someone desperate, isolated, and willing to believe anything to feel like he belonged. On March 1st, just days before the murders, Jacob purchased a .40 caliber handgun. And in the early hours of March 2nd, he drove to the Kramer home, smashed the window, and carried out the plan exactly as Johnny had instructed. After the murders, Jacob Nodarse panicked. He left the house through the back door, ran through neighboring yards, and eventually made it to his car. But instead of going home, he started driving south toward Florida, where his parents lived. Along the way, his paranoia grew. He kept checking his rearview mirror, convinced that either the police or Johnny's gang was following him. At one point, he even called 911 himself, saying he thought someone was after him.
My name is Leslie. I'm driving on the highway, heading towards Florida on I-75. And there's been, what, 7 cars or so constantly flashing their lights. There's people behind it, chased by some random hard for a long time in Indiana. I have a feeling that they're cops. Their mother or something. I don't know what the hell's going on. Is there anything you can tell me? I'm right away. Thank you, man.
Police tracked the burner phone he had been using and eventually found him asleep in his car outside his parents' home in Florida. When they arrested him and brought him in for questioning, Jacob broke down almost immediately.
What did you do before you left? You know why I'm asking you that, right? Because there's something in there that you don't want to tell me.
The problem here is that I'm scared.
You're scared.
Repercussions if I open my mouth. He would go after my family.
Only way that you can help yourself and help your family is to tell the truth. Because then we can deal with everybody involved and we can make sure they don't harm them.
Oh God, this is awful.
What happened?
I really choice.
Doesn't sound like it.
There's no turning back. It's started. My family's going to be safe. You say?
You tell the truth, 100%. Yes. Johnny is telling you that you have to do this or your family's at risk, correct?
Yeah.
Jacob confessed to shooting the Kramers. He described the entire night in detail, how Johnny had manipulated him, how he believed the drug gang story, how he thought he was protecting his own family by killing theirs, and he named Johnny Borizov as the mastermind. Johnny was arrested shortly after, and in a move that would later prove critical to the prosecution, police placed Johnny and Jacob in adjacent jail cells and recorded their conversations. Johnny, still trying to maintain control, continued to manipulate Jacob, telling him to stick to the story, warning him that the gang was still out there, and reminding him what would happen if he talked. But this time, investigators were listening. In 2011, Jacob Nodarse pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder. In exchange for his cooperation, he agreed to testify against Johnny Borizov. He was sentenced to 75 years in prison. Johnny Borizov's trial began in 2013. His defense tried to paint Jacob as a mentally unstable liar who had acted alone, but the evidence was overwhelming. Prosecutors presented the jail recordings where Johnny could be heard threatening Jacob and reinforcing the lies he had told. They presented phone records showing the burner phone calls. They presented testimony from Angela, from investigators, and from Jacob himself, who described in excruciating detail how Johnny had orchestrated every step of the plan. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Johnny Borizov was found guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In his sentencing, the judge said, "For the terrifying minutes you spent inside the Kramer home, you must now spend hopeless years inside a prison cell." Today, Johnny Borizov remains in prison. His mother has launched a campaign claiming his innocence, arguing that he is in poor health and deserves compassion. But investigators, the jury, and the Kramer family have never wavered. Johnny Borizov orchestrated the murders of 3 innocent people out of nothing more than spite, jealousy, and a desire for revenge. Jacob Nodarse, now in his late 30s, is also still incarcerated. He has expressed remorse for his actions, but that remorse cannot undo the devastation he caused. Angela and Anthony Kramer survived that night, but they lost nearly everyone they loved. Sadly, the world has seen far too many cases where entire families are wiped out for no real reason. Like the horrifying fate of the Kramer family, the next case is just as disturbing. On January 11, 1996, the Mueller family was discovered brutally murdered inside the very home where they should have been safest.
It was bad for Bill and Nancy to have to die the way they did. But for a 7-year-old girl to die that way, to be wrapped with plastic, to be wrapped with duct tape, to have a 60-pound rock strapped to her body and thrown into a lake, there was no excuse.
Killing an entire family is already a horrifying act, But to torture a child while her parents helplessly watched? That's pure evil beyond anything words can capture. This became the burning drive for the whole Pope County Sheriff's Office in Arkansas back in 1996. What started as an unthinkable, brutal crime would soon pull back the curtain on an even darker web of secrets, all tied to one terrifying thing: white supremacy. No doubt about it, this is one of the most disturbing and ruthless cases we've ever covered on this channel. And it leaves you with one huge question. How does a mindset this twisted spiral into such heartless violence? Now, before we try to answer that, let's take a closer look at the victims, the Mueller family. For starters, the Muellers weren't just any ordinary family. They were gun enthusiasts, a lifestyle that defined much of their world. The father, William Mueller, wasn't just a passionate collector. He was a federal firearms licensee, meaning he was a licensed gun dealer. He also worked as a self-employed electrician, and his life revolved around guns, selling them, buying them, and even using them. He was married to Nancy, and together they raised their 8-year-old daughter, Sarah, their only child. They loved her with all their hearts, and she was the center of their world. The family lived in Tilly, Arkansas, a small, tight-knit community where William and Nancy homeschooled Sarah. Weekends were often spent at gun shows, a shared hobby that only brought them closer together as a family. Given this, it's no surprise that their home was packed to the brim with firearms, ammunition, and a hefty stash of cash. With all that valuable loot just sitting there, it made the perfect target for a robbery. And that's exactly what happened in 1995. The Mueller home was broken into by a man named Kirby Kehoe, who, shockingly, was a family friend. He stole guns and cash, but instead of letting this setback shake them, the Mueller family didn't miss a beat. The robbery didn't stop their passion for firearms or their business. Now, keep this robbery in mind because it's going to be crucial in the investigation that unfolds later. Fast forward to January of 1996. The Mueller family was out of the house, probably spending some quality, relaxed time together. But little did they know, waiting in the shadows of their home were two monsters, ready to strike the moment they walked through the door. As soon as they entered, the Muellers were confronted by these two men. They were dressed like FBI agents, but don't be fooled. These guys weren't the real deal. They were imposters. Without wasting a second, they tied the family to chairs, and when William Mueller, who was 52 years old at that time, refused to cooperate, things took a terrifying turn. The intruders separated the family, and they began to torture them while interrogating. They did everything in their power to force the Muellers to talk. But when the parents still didn't give in, they turned their attention to the 8-year-old Sarah. This is where it gets absolutely chilling. Sarah was interrogated about the family's fortune, about where they kept their money and valuables. And to make her talk, one of the men shocked her with an electric cattle prod. While this isn't enough to kill a person, the pain is excruciating, especially for a young child like Sarah. After the little girl gave them the information they were after, they found $50,000 in cash, along with guns and ammunition. Now, you might think they'd just grab what they came for and leave, but that's not how it went. The nightmare was far from over. The Muellers were then subdued with stun guns, which knocked them unconscious. The intruders took their sweet time with this, almost like they were enjoying the slow, agonizing process. But it didn't stop there. The worst was yet to come. The two men suffocated them by placing sealed plastic bags over their heads. Imagine the horror of knowing your entire family is being tortured, helpless, and unable to stop it. That's the reality the Muellers were facing in those final moments. Now, if you thought the Muellers were found dead right after that horrifying night, well, you'd be wrong. The truth is, 2 weeks passed before anyone realized something was horribly wrong. Nancy Mueller's mom, Earlene Branch, hadn't heard a word from her daughter in all that time. That was totally unlike Nancy. She always called after their trips, especially when they went to those gun shows. So Earlene couldn't shake that gut feeling something bad had happened. She reached out to the sheriff, sharing her growing concern. Sheriff Jay Winters knew the Muellers, even though they lived in a neighboring county, and he agreed to help. But when he spoke to people in the neighborhood, they didn't seem worried at all. Most people figured the Muellers had just taken off somewhere, maybe a quick trip or a break from everything, and hadn't bothered to check in. It almost felt like everyone thought they were just giving themselves some space, and everything was fine. Then, on February 11th, an entire month later, the case took a terrifying turn. A farmer just going about his day found the Muellers' Jeep. It was hidden, abandoned on the side of the highway, far from where it should have been. This discovery set the investigation into motion again. Inside the Jeep was Nancy Mueller's purse, and it still held her wallet and ID. But the trailer was empty, with no sign of the family anywhere. As days turned into weeks, weeks into months, the Muellers' disappearance became even more unsettling. No leads, no clues, just the eerie silence of their absence. Then, 5 months later, a twist in the case came when an elderly couple decided to spend a day fishing in a bayou near Russellville. While waiting for a bite, the woman snagged her fishing line on something, and when she tried to free it, she quickly realized she had hooked a boot that still held the bone of a man's leg inside it. Horrified, she cut the line and rushed for help. This set off another search, led by Sheriff Winters, who organized teams to scour the bayou with metal hooks and divers. By the end of the day, they had recovered parts of a body. The torso was weighed down by a rock, and the head was wrapped in duct tape. From the moment investigators saw the body, they knew this wasn't some ordinary crime. It looked like an execution, deliberate, cold, and calculated. The body was that of a small female, and at first investigators thought it could be the body of a 6-year-old girl who had been reported missing from a nearby county the year before. But when they examined the size and the clothing, it didn't match. That's when they started to wonder, could this be Sarah Mueller? The next day, 2 more partial bodies were discovered. All 3 torsos were weighed down with rocks, and their heads were wrapped in plastic bags, secured tightly with duct tape. It was a chilling scene. Using dental records, DNA, and clothing, the authorities confirmed the identities of the bodies. It was William Mueller, his wife Nancy, and their 8-year-old daughter Sarah. What had started as a missing persons case had quickly turned into a brutal triple homicide investigation. When the coroner examined the bodies, they concluded that they'd probably been in the water since January 11th, the last day anyone had seen them. But there was more to the story. The investigators found tiny specks of blue paint stuck to the tape. They sent the paint samples to the FBI lab in Washington, D.C. for testing, and it was confirmed that the paint matched the type used on General Motors vehicles. With this new lead, investigators pieced together that 2 people must have been involved. One drove the blue car with the bodies, while the other followed in the Mueller's Jeep. By the time the bodies were dumped in the water, the Muellers were likely already dead, suffocated by the plastic bags. The investigation soon turned back to the Muellers' belongings. Since the family had vanished, most of their valuables had been taken by relatives, but some items had been left behind, stored in their landlord's garage. Among the things found were a Colt .45 gun case with a serial number, but the gun was missing. They also found a family photo with some friends. The team entered the gun's serial number into the National Crime Information Center database, and bingo. The gun had been traced to a man named Travis Brake, who had been arrested months earlier in Seattle, Washington, for carrying a concealed weapon. He admitted that he'd bought the handgun at a gun show and described 2 men he had bought it from. One of the men stood out to him. Investigators showed Brake the photo they found among the Muellers' belongings, and Brake pointed to one of the men, Kirby Kehoe. If you remember, this was the same man who had robbed the Muellers a year prior, and this guy was no stranger to trouble. He had a long criminal history involving firearms and was heavily involved in the white supremacist movement. However, the investigators still needed solid evidence before they could make an arrest. Nearly a year after the Mueller's murder, investigators got a break in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. A trooper spotted a blue Chevy Suburban with suspicious bumper stickers parked in a handicapped spot. Inside, Sean Haynes and his pregnant girlfriend were found asleep. The trooper ran the serial numbers on 2 guns Haynes had in the vehicle and discovered one, a stolen AR-15 rifle, had belonged to the Muellers. Arrested and questioned, Haynes admitted he had traded another firearm for the rifle at a Washington motel 6 months earlier. The traitor? Chevy Kehoe, Kirby Kehoe's eldest son. At this point, the investigators had 2 suspects, but before we dive deeper into the case, let's take a moment to understand the background of the Kehoe family. Trust me, knowing their story will shed light on why they did what they did. Now, the Kehoe family was nothing like the Muellers. Chevy Kehoe, 26 years old, grew up in a household where white supremacy wasn't just talked about, it was their way of life. Chevy wasn't your average troubled young man. His father's influence shaped everything, steering the family down a dark and hateful path. When Chevy was just a baby, the Kehoes packed their bags and left sunny Florida for the quiet hills of Madison County, North Carolina. Fast forward to the mid-'80s. The Kehoes moved again, this time to Stevens County in Washington. Initially, Chevy seemed like a bright kid with potential. He was an honor student at Colville Junior High School, but by 1988, his parents decided to homeschool him. Their reasoning? They wanted to provide more focused attention. But instead of fostering a healthy learning environment, they created a bubble of radical ideas. From a young age, he was pushed into a life of crime, learning robbery, theft, and how to fight off the cops. As you can imagine, the Kehoe home was a breeding ground for hate and paranoia. Anti-government beliefs were their bread and butter, and Chevy soaked it all up. He wasn't just a kid with big dreams. His dreams were violent, dangerous, and fueled by white supremacy. By the time he was a young man, Chevy had one goal: to overthrow the U.S. government and create his own white supremacist utopia, something he called the Aryan People's Republic. This wasn't just a phase. For Chevy, this twisted vision was everything, and his family were the foundation for his dangerous ideology. You could see this influence clearly in 1995, when Chevy took part in a violent kidnapping and robbery. In June of that year, he and a partner targeted Malcolm and Jill Friedman, a Jewish couple who owned a store where Chevy had once worked. The Friedmans were held at gunpoint, but this wasn't just a random crime. Chevy specifically went after them because of their ethnicity. This act was a clear reflection of the hate and violence he'd been raised to embrace. With everything going on, it was no surprise that both Kirby Kehoe and his son, Chevy Kehoe, had been on police radars for years. If Chevy was involved in all kinds of crimes, just imagine the trouble his father, Kirby, had been up to. But here's the kicker. Despite the long history of criminal activity, both of them were nowhere to be found. No one could track them down, and they seemed to vanish into thin air. That is, until February 15, 1977, when a state trooper in Ohio pulled over a blue Chevy Suburban. The car had been swerving, driving way too slowly, and just looked suspicious. While passing by, the driver didn't even glance at the trooper, but the passenger gave him a nod. The officer thought nothing of it until he realized the passenger kept staring at him through the rearview mirror, even after they passed him by. That was when the officer's instincts started kicking in. They ran the license plate and found that it had expired. To top it off, neither of them had valid driver's licenses. When the trooper asked the driver to get out of the vehicle, the guy complied, but warned the officer not to touch him. Then things took a turn. One of the deputies called for a tow truck to impound the vehicle, and that's when the driver suddenly bolted back to the car. The officers chased after him, but as they tried to subdue him, the guy who was sitting in the passenger seat pulled out a handgun and started firing at the officers, creating enough chaos for Chevy to jump back into the Suburban and make a break for it.
asked the driver to step out of the car. The man told the officer he borrowed the truck from a friend. He then refused to a pat-down search. Listen as the officer attempts to search the man for weapons.
Any guns, knives, clubs, stuff like that on here, sir?
I don't want you going and searching through all my stuff.
I'm not searching through your stuff, sir. I'm going to put you in my car.
Oh, that's just fine. But
Now, do you have any guns, knives, clubs, or stuff like that on you? Very good.
Listen, sir, I don't want no problems.
I'm not going to give you any problems, sir.
Apparently, he did want problems. A few more minutes went by. Then the man ran back to his car in an attempt to get away. The passenger then opened fire on the police.
Please!
As the passenger ran into the woods, the driver sped away.
By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every week. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Turns out, the two men in that intense standoff were Chevy Kehoe and his brother, Cheney Kehoe. When Chevy took off in the Suburban, Cheney, who was in the passenger seat, bolted into the nearby woods. The cops spent the entire day searching for him, but as you might expect, they couldn't catch him. Now, just like Chevy, Cheney was also deeply embedded in white supremacy, and he wasn't afraid to use violence to push his beliefs. Later that day, Chevy found himself involved in another shootout, this time in the parking lot of an electrical supply company. He exchanged gunfire with two Wilmington police officers, Officer Richard Rick Wood and Sergeant Robert Bob Martin. During the chaos, an innocent bystander, 56-year-old Frank Marsden, was hit in the shoulder. The shootout was captured on the dash cameras of both the trooper and the sergeant, and it quickly became a major story. The footage was aired in 1997 on Fox's World's Scariest Police Shootouts and became a hit, showing up on other programs like Most Shocking and World's Most Amazing Videos. Meanwhile, the Kehoe brothers were on the run, traveling in secret with their families across multiple states in an RV. Investigators feared they'd stop at nothing to escape, and the police had to step up their efforts. They spread out images of the brothers, hoping someone would recognize them or the vehicle. At Lake Hill Campground, investigators discovered that the Kehoes had camped there in an RV, but they were 2 days too late. The RV had already left. Days turned into weeks, and sightings of the RV kept pouring in from across the country. They had been spotted in places like West Virginia, North Carolina, Alabama, Texas, and Montana, always just one step ahead of the law. In Indianapolis, the stolen van with Chevy's signature gas receipt was found, but there was no sign of Cheney. A few days later, the Kehoe's RV was found abandoned on a desolate stretch of road in Wyoming. When the police checked it out, they discovered a disturbing stash: guns, ammunition, fake FBI jackets, U.S. Marshals badges, and a box full of bomb-making materials. The ATF bomb squad was called in to inspect, and although they didn't find any live devices, the components made it clear the Kehoes were preparing for something far worse. Authorities were deeply concerned about the brothers' growing violence and what they might do next. As the search continued, it seemed like the Kehoes were always one step ahead. But then, on June 16, 1997, investigators received a tip. Cheney Kehoe, Chevy's brother, was ready to turn himself in. Cheney revealed where he and his brother had been hiding for the past few months, and authorities learned that after the shootouts in Ohio, they had taken refuge on a remote ranch in southern Utah. The owners had given them room and board in exchange for help on the farm. But things had gone south quickly when Chevy's temper flared and his paranoia grew. Chevy even spoke about killing his wife, Karina, who had Native American ancestry, and plotting to murder his own parents, Kirby and Gloria, to raise his younger brothers in his white supremacist vision. Then, on June 12th, Chevy's paranoia turned against his own brother. After a violent argument, Cheney feared for his life and the safety of his family. He decided to flee with his loved ones in the middle of the night, driving nearly 1,000 miles back to Washington State, and that ended their long time running. Chevy Kehoe was arrested on June 17, 1997. But that's not the most important part. The most interesting and important thing Cheney told law enforcement is that Chevy confessed to being involved in the murder of the Muellers with another unnamed male. Additionally, around that time, in June of 1997, Kirby Kehoe, the father of the Kehoe brothers, was also arrested. Now, as you can imagine, the arrest of the father didn't exactly fit the narrative everyone was expecting. He wasn't involved with the Mueller family's murder, nor was Cheney Kehoe. But just when the situation seemed to be unraveling, Gloria Kehoe, Chevy's mother, stepped forward to law enforcement and dropped a bombshell. Gloria revealed that her son, Chevy, had confessed to her about the horrifying details of the Mueller family slaying. She went on to explain that the murders weren't just some spontaneous act, they were planned out for a whole year. The plan went way back to the first robbery of the Mueller family back in February of 1995, which had apparently set everything in motion. According to Gloria, the chain of events started when William Mueller, the patriarch of the Mueller family, confronted Kirby Kehoe after suspecting him of being involved in the robbery. Apparently, during this confrontation, William Mueller was incredibly disrespectful to Kirby, which did not sit well with Chevy. In fact, it seemed to be the moment that flipped a switch in Chevy's mind. He thought that William's disrespect was enough to give him the green light to go ahead and rob and kill the Muellers. But there was more to it than just a grudge over disrespect. According to law enforcement, Chevy's motivation wasn't just personal. He had found out that William Mueller was in possession of some serious weaponry, expensive firearms, high-end gear, and ammunition, and that piqued Chevy's interest even more. Gloria didn't stop there. She named a second man involved in the murders, Daniel Lewis Lee. Lee wasn't a stranger to Chevy. He was someone Chevy knew through their involvement in white supremacy groups. Both Chevy and Lee were heavily invested in the idea of creating a whites-only nation, and they were bound by their shared ideology. Together, they had planned to rob the Muellers, kill them, and cover up their tracks to avoid implicating themselves or Kirby in the crime. Gloria went on to explain that on January 11, 1996, the Mueller family had left for a gun show. While they were gone, Chevy and Lee dressed up as law enforcement officers and made their way to the Mueller home. When the Muellers returned, Chevy and Lee ambushed them, tying them up. But there was one part of the plan that didn't go as expected. According to Gloria, Lee was hesitant, especially when it came to killing Sarah Mueller, the Mueller family's daughter. Apparently, Lee just couldn't bring himself to do it, so Chevy took matters into his own hands and killed Sarah himself. Fast forward to March of 1999, and Daniel Lewis Lee and Chevy Kehoe stood trial for the triple murder. Both Cheney and Gloria Kehoe testified against them, spilling the details of what had happened. The trial ended with a conviction. Chevy Kehoe was sentenced to life in prison, while Daniel Lewis Lee was sentenced to death. Apparently, Daniel Lewis Lee also had a deeply troubled upbringing, one that was marked by instability and violence. From a young age, Lee faced significant challenges. He struggled with seizures and other neurological issues that often led him to be placed in mental health facilities. However, his time in these facilities was short-lived, as he was removed due to his violent behavior. His struggles were compounded by his inability to control his anger and his growing propensity for violence, which only seemed to escalate as he got older. By the time Lee was 17, his violent tendencies had already manifested in a chilling way. He was involved in the brutal murder of Joseph Wavra, which occurred during a robbery. It was the third murder in a string of violent crimes, but incredibly, Lee managed to avoid a murder charge. Instead, he received only a suspended sentence for the robbery, a decision that seemed more lenient than it should have been, given the severity of the crime. Unfortunately, this leniency did little to curb Lee's violent impulses. It only appeared to embolden him, allowing his thirst for violence to grow unchecked. It wasn't long before Lee crossed paths with Chevy Kehoe. The two met in 1995, and their shared hatred for the government and their twisted desire to establish a white supremacist stronghold brought them together. Now, Lee tried to soften his image in court, claiming he had a good side and that he could change. It felt a bit ridiculous, though. His past was full of violent acts. His plea for mercy sounded more like a movie redemption arc than reality. The court didn't buy it. Lee's past was too ugly, and no one believed he could really change. In the end, he was executed by lethal injection in 2020.
For the first time in 17 years, a federal prison inmate was executed this morning. Daniel Lewis Lee received a lethal injection in Indiana after the U.S. Supreme Court allowed the execution to proceed. He was convicted of murdering 3 members of an Arkansas family back in 1996, including an 8-year-old girl. Lee told witnesses this morning, though, that he didn't do it. The High Court, with conservative justices in the majority, voted 5-4 overnight to reverse the lower court rulings. Those courts had been concerned with what they called an unconstitutional risk of pain when it comes to lethal injection.
Despite being the mastermind behind the brutal murders of the Mueller family, Chevy Kehoe managed to escape the death penalty, while Daniel Lewis Lee, who had a less direct role, was sentenced to death. This didn't seem to make sense. How could the guy who planned and carried out the whole thing get a lighter sentence than his partner in crime? But what made things even crazier was that Chevy was involved in another huge crime, the Oklahoma City bombing. After Chevy was arrested, his brother Cheney claimed Chevy knew about the bombing before it happened. Apparently, Chevy was seen with Timothy McVeigh, the bomber, at a motel in Spokane months before the bombing. The manager of that motel even said that Chevy had been excited about the bombing when the news hit and had even hinted that something big was going to happen on April 19th. Yet, when the FBI looked into it, they couldn't find any proof that McVeigh had ever been in Spokane or that Chevy had any direct involvement in the bombing. Chevy denied everything, but the rumors just added to the mystery. It was clear that Chevy had ties to violent extremist groups, and yet he still got off easy compared to Lee. At the end, Cheney Kehoe received a 24-year sentence for attempted murder and weapons possession due to his role in an Ohio shootout, while their father, Kirby Kehoe, was sentenced to 44 months after pleading guilty to federal racketeering charges. Later, Cheney's sentence was reduced to 11 years, and he was released from prison in 2008. But Cheney's trouble with the law didn't end there. On October 14, 2013, he and Kirby were arrested by federal officials in Arizona after an ATF raid uncovered a large marijuana growing operation and an arsenal of weapons at an off-grid compound. Authorities seized 17 firearms, nearly 17,000 rounds of ammunition, 15 pounds of marijuana, and various pieces of body armor. Both Cheney and Kirby pleaded guilty to being felons in possession of firearms and ammunition in 2014. Cheney was sentenced to 41 months in prison, while Kirby received a 10-year sentence. Cheney was released in September 2016, and Kirby followed in January 2022. As for Chevy, he spent much of his time at the United States Penitentiary, Florence ADX in Colorado, under the Federal Bureau of Prisons Register number 21300-009. He was later transferred to several different prisons, including United States Penitentiary, Florence High, and United States Penitentiary, McCreary in Kentucky. By 2022, Chevy Kehoe was being held at the United States Penitentiary, Terre Haute, and one can only hope that he's suffering there more than his victims did. But what do you think about all this? Do you believe justice was served, or do you think the law went too easy on them, especially considering their anti-government beliefs? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. If you like the way we create these videos and you want to help bring more cases like this to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you once again for watching.